walk through the fire, His name lifted higher. Nothing can ever separate us from the love of God. Those not awakened, whose faith may shake it, and only through Jesus is free. Eternity stays. Even when everything's crumbling, don't give up. Fight to hold on. We must ignore the forces that come for surrender. It's always darkest just before dawn. Even when your heart is tired and broken, we have a Redeemer who loves us, protects us as we walk through the fire. His name lifted higher. Nothing can ever separate us from the love of God. Those not awakened, whose faith may be shaken, only through Jesus is freedom. Eternity, chaos, distractions, corruption, fear, rejection, panic, the reckoning is here. Manufactured divisions, the enemies within. We will expose them down with winds. We walk through the fire, His name lifted higher. Nothing can ever separate us from the love of God. Who's not awakened, whose faith may be shaken, only through Jesus is freedom. Eternity, walk through the fire.
Welcome. This is Bill Donahue with Discerning Truths. Normally, we're here talking about Jesus and Jesus-related subjects, Bible-related subjects. Monday and Wednesday, I teach through a book of the Bible. Right now, I'm in the book of Daniel, and on Friday, I talk about subjects related to Christianity, sometimes barely related, but we're here. This is pretty related because I'm going to look at the Exodus account, and I made it my practice. I read a few books in the Zondervan series. It's called the Counterpoint series, where there's 3 or 5 views given by Christians, who disagree on the details, but they're Christians, so they claim to believe the Bible, and they give their different presentations. So I expressed the desire to read the rest of the series. I put out a list of books on my Telegram page, and one of my listeners, Miss Olson, bought, I don't know, 7 or 8 of them. So these are one of the first ones that I read through, and this is called 5 Views on the Exodus. And like I said in my post to announce this show, I was aware of 3 views. The Exodus is a complete myth with no historical basis. The Exodus is a partial myth, okay? Or the Bible's accurate. In these 5 views, none of the views say the Bible's accurate. One gets close. One says it's accurate except for one point of information. But even the 3 views I was aware of aren't fully represented here. That's a little disappointing, right? But with that, I'm going to get into the study because I have a lot of slides, and I want to, I'm going to go out. I don't normally paddle on Fridays, but I have an opportunity to get some lessons in a one-man canoe, and currently I'm very good at flipping them over. I'd like to get better at paddling them without being upside down. So I'm going to take that as soon as I get off the air and, get out there and try it. So I'm going to get right into the study, right? So like I said, the book 5 Views on Exodus, the historicity, the chronology, and the theological implications. That's the title. Rolls right off your tongue. It's edited by Mark Jensen, and like I said, published by Zondervan. And it presents 5 scholarly perspectives on the biblical Exodus account, right? Each contributor presents their view and defends it, and then the others criticize them, and he responds to those criticisms, and then there's a rejoinder from the criticisms, like a rebuttal to the rebuttal, right? So that format allows me to spot weaknesses in their argument immediately because usually the guys arguing with them have already spotted those weaknesses. So when they criticize them, you can see it, right? And so, sorry. Like I said, all 5 views in this book either downplay the size of the Israelite population during the Exodus and make the biblical account semi-historical, or they reject out the historicity of the Exodus altogether. That was disappointing to me. I thought at least one of the 5 views would represent one of the 3 views I was aware of, right? And the closest thing that comes to that is Scott Stripling. He tries to follow the Bible. He supports the historicity of Exodus, the 10 plagues. He looks at the Bible as his primary source. But he wasn't able to resolve evidence in the late Bronze Age in Canaan of populations that size. And so in Exodus 12:37 it says there were 600,000 Israelite men that left Egypt. Add to that women and children, you get a population group well over 1 million people. And he can't find evidence of that. So he just figured the Bible got that point wrong, right? But he's the closest you're going to get in this book to somebody who actually believes the Bible is accurate. If you know, while I don't agree with everybody's interpretation, my position is the Bible is inspired by the Holy Spirit and it's accurate. And what happens to people when the academic sources present them either don't believe in the Bible or watch these videos from knuckleheads claiming they found chariot wheels under the Red Sea and horses' bones and all kinds of other stuff, the Ron Wyatts of the world. There's Exodus videos out there claiming they have that. They have a rock split in Saudi Arabia, and that's the rock that Moses hit. They do all these videos. So you're kind of stuck. Academia tells me it's fable, and these guys claim there's proof. So I'm going to believe these guys. Well, those guys are scammers. They're grifters, and it's just horrible. There is an alternative position, and we're going to discuss it as we get further into this study. Mostly they disagreed about the date it happened, and there are 5 positions, right? And Scott Stripling takes the position that it happened in the 15th century, like 1446 BC. He's using the, the biblical chronology to get to those dates. So he's seeing as Amenhotep II or Tutmosis III as the Pharaoh or the Exodus. And he's using 1 Kings 6:1 in 418th year after, the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt. In the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, he began to build the house of the Lord. So he's taking in passages and he's counting back 418 years and going, well, that's when the date is. And this is a common practice in Christianity. Problem is the exact date of Solomon's not as solid as people want to do. But if you get Solomon and the temple construction about 966 BC, and then you add the 480 years and onto that, you're going to get back there. And then he looks at other supporting texts like Judges 11:26 with 300 years from the conquest of Jephthah, and 1 Chronicles 6:33-37 counting genealogies, in Exodus 41 and Acts 7:29 and 30. So he went to the Bible, and he's trying to start with the Bible. So, and he identifies the departure site as Avarice, not a lot of people think they left from Pi Ramses, as in Exodus 1:11. So, I mean, the Bible, Exodus 1:11 says, then they set taskmasters over them to afflict them in heavy burdens, and they built the Pharaoh's store cities, Python and Ramses, right? And so this Pi Ramses is that complex of Python and Ramses. And so, based on that verse, if they were there building it, that's where the biblical scholars generally say they left from. He takes them from leaving from Avarice, which is kind of interesting, you know? And then he emphasizes archaeological evidence like the destruction layers at the sites at Jericho and Hazor, which are consistent with the 15th century conquest, right? But Stripling views the Exodus as fully historical with the biblical numbers of 600,000 men in Exodus 27, possibly representing thousands, not requiring a drastic reduction. I don't know about drastic. He gets down into the 10,000s. Okay? So the Bible says 600,000 men plus women and children, and his total group is in the 10,000s, but they're arguing that he didn't make drastic reductions. I don't know what you call a drastic reduction, but I see that as sizable. And but his reasons for it is he can't find evidence of it. So, you know, the lack of evidence apparently to him is evidence the Bible's wrong. And then the late date, and this is James Hoffenmeyer holds this position. He proposes the Exodus happened around 1260 BC under Pharaoh Ramses II. And he supports this with archaeological evidence of a Semitic Levantine populations in northern Egypt during the time of the New Kingdom period, including enslavement practices and toponyms matching biblical geography. Okay? And then, so he's using Pi Ramses in Exodus 1:11 and Numbers 33:3 that they set out there. And it says, they set out from Ramses in the first month and the 15th day of the first month. So Passover, Passover's the 14th. They had the blood on the doornate, and they set forth the next day. He points the Egyptian loanwords in the Torah, like papyrus ark in Exodus 2:3, and the route in Exodus chapters 13 and 14, as alignment with known Egyptian landscapes. He interprets the 480 years in 1 Kings 6:1 as symbolic, 12 generations of 40 years each, allowing for alignment with I didn't highlight that. Merneptah steel. I don't know even how to pronounce that word. Yeah. But with that steel, which is around 1208 BC. And it mentions Israel as a people in Canaan. So if they're in Canaan in 1208 and they left Egypt in 1260, that lines up. And he affirms the historicity of the Exodus, but again, he reduces the population to tens of thousands for plausibility and ties Moses potentially to the Hyksos heritage. Okay, when I get to the date of the Hyksos, you're going to watch how they're playing fast and loose. Because he's in the 13th century, right? 1260 BC. The Hyksos are way before that. But because he has this Hyksos heritage, he's trying to connect Moses to that heritage and to go through, which happened, the Hyksos were kicked out centuries earlier from Egypt. And then Peter Feynman, he just buys into the Hyksos Levite-led Exodus in the time of Ramses II. Again, 1250 BC. There's no evidence of Hyksos in Egypt in 1250 BC at all, right? And he's saying that this is rooted in their memory of Hyksos expulsion in 1550 BC. Okay, and I'm questioning the date of even 1550 but that's the traditional date for the Hyksos expulsion is in the 16th century BC. And here he's in the 13th century, and he's trying to connect the dots. And so this is a problem for me. And he argues that the Levites, including Moses as a Hyksos descendant, exited Egypt while other Israelite tribes were indigenous to Canaan. They later unified under a shared narrative, and this explains the lack of massive archaeological traces in the event involved a much smaller group. They're all stuck on this fact that they can't find campsites from, 3,000 years ago? They can't find campsites of 1,000,000 people. I don't know if you can find my campsites that I used 40 years ago, but biblical elements like store cities in Exodus 1:1, Exodus 1:11, and Ramesside, Egypt, and Meneptah Stele confirm Israel's presence shortly after 1250, 1260 BC. They do that. So Feynman sees the Exodus story as semi-historical event, possibly involving a much smaller number of Hyksos that was adapted by Israel for national identity. Okay, so Israel didn't have an exodus. The Hyksos had an exodus. They met up with the Israelites who were in Canaan, and then the group got together and they took on the national identity of the Hyksos. You got to go a long way. When you start denying the Bible, it's very fast. You start denying it completely. Alternative late date, Exodus took place in the 12th century BC. Now we're in the 1100s, right? And this is Gary N. Rensburg. He advocates for a historical Exodus in 1170 BC under Ramesses III, emphasizing archaeological surveys showing a surge in highland settlements in Canaan around 1200 BC, and marking Israel's emergence. Okay? And then he prioritizes genealogies in the Bible, from Moses to later figures, over strict chronologies, viewing numbers like 480 and 1 Kings 6:1 as non-literal or rhetorical. And I talked to you about a lot of stuff in the Bible, compositional devices that are non-literal. He's just saying this is another one. It's a non-literal compositional device. I don't think it is in this idea, right? The linguistic evidence, such as archaic Hebrew in the Song of the Sea in Exodus 15, supports a 12th century composition. I don't know, archaic Hebrew was a long way before that. I mean, it could have been in the 15th century. They were still using archaic Hebrew. The Meneptah Stele is seen as pre-Exodus, with Israel as a nascent group. They're just beginning. Israel didn't exist, right? Apparently, when they came into existence with Moses, they didn't come into existence before and go into captivity in Egypt. They came into existence as they came out of Egypt. And this conflicts with scriptural account of Israel having been an existing nation when it was taken into captivity with Egypt. So if I read this book looking for confirmation of the Bible, I'd be in serious trouble here, right? Then we get to Ronald Hendel. Now, Ronald Hendel thinks it's just a cultural memory. Didn't actually happen, at least not to the Israelites. Happened to the Hyksos. But he sees the Exodus as non-historical, a cultural memory, a blend that is historical reminiscence of Semitic migrations, or a conflict with Egypt and Canaan, and traditional motifs. And then you invented the idea of 400 years of slavery and all that stuff, and you did that. And he says, it's like many other Near Eastern epics. They're not really historical, and proofs irrelevant as the narrative shapes identity, as redemption themes. He's just saying that it's there. In Exodus 6, 6, and 7, and you hear me quote these promises from God every time we do Passover. And this is the one promise that uh, associated with the third cup at the Passover meal. When the meal was ended, he took the cup and he blessed it and gave thanks, and he does it. It's called the cup of redemption, and it comes from this promise: I am the Lord, I will redeem you with outstretched arms. Okay? Now, as Christians, you can see the prophecy here, right? Because Jesus, with outstretched arms on the cross, redeemed us, right? And then he claimed there's no archaeological evidence of a mass enslavement. Okay, he claims, this is a Christian, right? Professing Christian, said there is no archaeological evidence of mass enslavement or conquest. And this claimed absence of evidence is said to support his view. And you'll often hear the claim that if there's no corroborating evidence of the biblical account of the Exodus, but I've already shown you from academic sources that's false in my earlier studies on Exodus. And we're going to go over a little of it here. Okay? I'll tell you, just one source that I know of has corroborated in Egyptian sources alone 700. I haven't talked to him in at least 3 years. He was over 700 pieces of evidence from Egyptian sources 3 years ago. So that's a long way from not any evidence, correct? So the early date, I looked at the strengths and weaknesses of each one. So Stripling in his early date, and I'm calling it 15, whatever, the 14, the traditional date in the 15th century, the early date. It has strong alignment with explicit biblical chronologies, right? In 1 Kings 6:1 and Exodus 12:40 and 41. And the time that the people lived in Israel was 430 years. Archaeological ties to the 15th century, like the destruction of Jericho, bolster the historicity. So it has those strengths. He's taken the Bible seriously. He has other corroboration that is in the biblical Exodus story, like the destruction of Jericho, that seem to corroborate that time frame. The weakness, as Hoffenmeyer and Rendsburg counter, that it conflicts with this Meneptah stele, which is an Egyptian record, implying insufficient time, about 200 years, for Israel to grow into a significant entity by the 13th century. Well, if they only left at a few thousand, they can't grow there. But if they left with over 1 million people, 2 centuries is plenty of time for them to be a serious entity by the 13th century, right? And Fenham notes a mismatch in site identifications, that Stripling goes with Everest instead of Pi-Ramses, the two cities. And biblically, it assumes literal numbers, but in Genesis and Exodus genealogies, 4 generations from Levi to Moses, and Exodus 6:16-20 suggest a shorter sojourn if taken strictly, creating tensions with 430 years. And this is what you're saying. So here you go. You got 4 generations mentioned in Exodus 6, but the Bible tells you it's 430 years. These are either very long generations, or some people were skipped in the genealogies. Geez, have we ever seen that happen before? Right? But they're criticizing them. They go, well, the Bible doesn't always have 430 years, right? Now, Hoffenmeyer, right? He's still with that later date, and he's got support with Semitic precedents and Egyptian toponyms. That's the use of Egyptian words in Hebrew, aligning with biblical details like the Ramesside era store cities. Okay, and it resolves the Meneptah stele by placing the conquest shortly before the stele's date, and its symbolic interpretation of 480 years as generation maintains scriptural integrity without literalism, right? If you take 480 years symbolically, he's saying I can still believe the Bible, I just don't believe the exact dates, right? His weakness, Stripling counters that it dismisses literal chronologies, 1 Kings 6:1, potentially undermining biblical precision. For a guy that thinks the Bible's wrong on the number of people that came out and wrong on the city they left from, I don't know how he can defend that this other view is undermining biblical precision, but that's what he argued. Handel argued that the evidence is circumstantial, not direct proof of the Exodus. It's correct. What it's proving is that Israel existed by these later date. It doesn't say when they began to exist or when they left Egypt, right? And biblically, it requires viewing numbers as stylized or symbolic, right? And we've seen that done in the Bible multiple times. So it's not unprecedented, but they argue that it might strain a high view of interpretation if literal interpretations are preferred over a historical record. So these guys are all going, if you want to take the Bible literally, you can't make any of these dates work, right? And we're going to, I just want to challenge this stuff because I want you to know I believe the Bible. And, I've studied the subject a little bit. And so you just kind of go, okay, what's the real story? So Feynman with this Hyksos and a Levite-led Exodus, long after the Hyksos, right? But he explains the sparse evidence by limiting the event to Levites, tying to historical Hyksos, echoing Semitic expulsions. So he's saying that these Levites left Exodus and they made up the rest of the story. And they made it up based on the previous expulsion of the Hyksos. And I'm going to deal with the Hyksos before the end of the stream, so don't worry about it. And Hofmeyr and Stripling countered that it fragments the biblical narrative when it says all Israel was enslaved in Exodus 1:13 and 14. So the Egyptians ruthlessly made the people of Israel serve, contradicting a unified historicity. Okay? And Redenberg notes weak links to the 13th century archaeology beyond memory. And biblically, it introduces division not explicit in Scripture. Though possibly resolvable, it accepts the idea of a later redaction, that somebody later edited the Hyksos expulsion and the Israelites' exodus and merged them, that there were Bible editing going on. Do I have any evidence of this redaction happening? The Bible, there's been redaction in the Bible. That's without doubt, right? We can see it in the manuscripts. Is there evidence of this redaction, including the Hyksos? And the answer is none. There's not one shred of evidence, okay? And then the alternative late date by Redenberg matches settlement archaeology, like a 1200 BC surge that they see an increased settlement, supporting Israel's emergence under Joshua and Judges. And the linguistic analysis of Exodus 15 as early strengthens that date for a late date. Its weaknesses in Stripling and Hofmeyr countered that it ignores key chronologies, like 1 Kings 5 and Judges 11, requiring dismissal of numbers as rhetorical. Handel sees it as overreaching historicity claims, and biblically it stretches 430-year sojourn in Exodus 12:40, potentially conflicting with genealogies unless viewed non-literally. At the 430 years is not a literal number and it's symbolic, then you can stretch the date to whatever you want, right? You can fudge the numbers in any direction you want to go. When the Bible speaks clearly, I think we ought to let it speak clearly. Now, Handel, he says, yeah, none of this is true. It's just a cultural memory. And he said that accounts for the archaeological silence, that the memory is based on fabrication, myths. And literate, he says there's no It's absolutely silent archaeological and in the literary parallels. There's nothing. But you have Baal myths that kind of parallel some stuff in the Bible. And he's going, yeah, this is just another Near Eastern myth. And emphasizing theological depth and focusing on redemption rather than historicity. Again, yeah, it's the message that God redeems. It's not the fact that he actually did it, right? And others counter that it denies historicity, contradicting biblical presentation as factual, with detailed itineraries, where they stopped, how long they traveled, in Numbers chapter 33. Stripling argue it reflects a postmodern bias. Okay? And postmodernism in Christianity is a bunch of Christians that don't believe the Bible. I just tell you right now, they take a very liberal view of the Bible. They don't think it's true, and they pick and choose like they're at a Chinese restaurant. I'll take one from column A and two from column B, and I'm going to make my theology out of there. And biblically, it challenges inspiration by treating as myth, though it's resolvable if viewing it all as symbolic. If you just take it all allegorically, then maybe there's some basis, right? But in Deuteronomy 4:34 it says, "Has any God ever attempted to go and take a nation for himself by trials, by signs and wonders?" This is Yahweh asking this. And he's looking to the Exodus as proof that he is greater than any other God, any other thing claimed to be God, right? We believe there's only really one God by nature, but there are plenty of other named gods in the Bible. And they're just created beings, and they're not gods on equal par with Yahweh. And he's going, do any of these other ones, can they do this? Right? And the most commonly proposed dates for the historical Exodus cluster around the 15th century, often 1446, 1447 BC, and the 13th century BC, 1260 to 1270. Those are the two. When you read most discussions that Exodus will be in one of those two time frames, okay? But I'm familiar with far more information, and some of these dates go back before 2000 BC, okay? And people that affirm the Bible as being true have put out dates going back to 2000 BC, and some even earlier, right? So some early scholarly proposals place Exodus in the early second millennial BC, potentially aligning with the broader incidents in Near Eastern migrations or pre-Hyksos Egyptian history. Their suggestion is Egypt was weakened by the exodus of the Jews, that it was in a weakened state because their pharaoh died, their army drowned, all that stuff, and that they were conquered by the Hyksos. And so they're putting the Exodus before the Hyksos range. And that logically makes some sense, right? The 1596 BC, and that's derived by adding up the narrative time periods in the Hebrew Bible. In the wilderness wandering of 40 years in Numbers 14:33, conquest periods, judgeship from Judges 1 and 1 Samuel, oppressions and reigns in Solomon's fourth year around 966 BC, and totaling about 630 years, and it gets you back into 596 in a completely different century than they're looking for much of this evidence, right? You have people that suggested 1536 BC. Okay? These are Christians based on Acts 13, 17 to 21 in the New Testament. Calculating back from Solomon's fourth year in 966 BC, everybody's assuming the same year for Solomon, and subtracting the reigns of David, 40 years in 2 Samuel 5:4, and Saul, 40 years, and 450 years of Judges, and the events after Canaan entry, and 40 years in the wilderness. And you keep subtracting, you get back to 1536 BC again. And in 1525, linked to the expulsion of the Hyksos. Okay, so this date is put up by people that believe the Hyksos and the Jews are the same people. And they see the Thera eruption, and this is a volcanic eruption, and as what is being described as biblical plagues. Okay, so we just saw 500 years earlier that it was supposedly aligned with the Hyksos expulsion in 2000, and now these people are saying the Hyksos expulsion's in 1556. Different dating methods. 1491, proposed by a 17th century chronologist, James Ussher. Bishop Ussher is the famous guy who used the genealogies in the Bible and calculated back and decided God created the earth on October 4th, 4004 BC. Okay? And he just says, I'm just going to use the chronologies. And I'm just telling you right now, I need nothing other than the Bible to prove there are gaps in the chronologies. But he didn't do those caps, and he came back with his dates. Then in 1477 to 1476 BC, this is an early 15th century date calculated by using biblical chronology with the temple destruction dated in 587. This is a Babylonian conquest, right? Adding 890 years from the Exodus to the destruction per traditional accounts of a line pre-New Kingdom. So 800 years gets you back in the early 15th century. 890 years. A slight variant of the early date gets you into 1440 BC. Adjusted for calendar alignments and reigns during the 18th dynasty. They didn't use the same calendars back then. The Jews didn't use the same calendar that they used today. All the dates that we do are all retro-calculated. It doesn't mean it aligns with the dates they used back then. And they're trying to make these adjustments. They're making assumptions, and they're moving 7 years in just from calendar adjustments. And 1406 BC is from the Septuagint. Okay, in 1 Kings 6:1, using 440 years instead of 480 years because the Septuagint version has a different time frame in Solomon's temple. The Septuagint is vastly different than the Masoretic text on the genealogies and on the dates of things. What did I tell you the last time we studied? You got to make sure you have the right text before you think you have the right interpretation. And we're not even sure what numbers are correct. 1310 to 1311 BC is traditionally the Jewish chronology. 890 years from the Exodus to the temple destruction in 421 BC. But we just said the temple destruction happened in 586. How did we get, suddenly we're in 421? The Jews date the Babylonian conquest at 421. But we're in Daniel, and all historic, we're putting in a 586. So even that more modern version of ancient history, we're off by, 160 years, 165 years? And in 1280 to 1270 BC, puts in the time of Ramesses II's reign in the 19th dynasty, based on Exodus 1:11, with the building of Pithom and Pi Ramses, and Judges 11:26 with 300 years to Japheth, which is from about 1100 BC. Okay? Well, I don't know how you get 300 years, 1100 to 1270, but we're here. In 1267 to 1260 BC, it's a Ramesses the second, right? And it's still reigning, but adjusted by Judges 11:26 chronology or Egyptian records. So you're seeing that clustering of dates here, right? And scholars like W.F. Albright, he was in the 1250 to 1225, right? And then he thinks that aligns better with the Menapostyle in 1219 BC, that Israel already existed. And then in 1200 BC. So we've now on this slide covered over 100 years. And we're still in 1200 BC, Ramesses III. In the 20th dynasty, instead of this is the third the son of Ramesses II, who's the 19th dynasty, based on Canaanite settlement patterns and Egyptian empire decline. So all these dates have been thrown out there for the Exodus by different people at different times. And like I said, I've seen some that even go back further. 1134 to 1130, and those are later proposals tied to Ramesses II, okay, or post-Ramesside shifts, okay, into a different dynasty, and sometimes adjusted from temple destruction chronologies or symbolic biblical numbers in earlier entries in the list, okay. So these dates reflect ongoing debates, with early proposals often prioritizing literal biblical chronologies, and late ones incorporating Egyptian archaeology. No single date has universal consensus among historians who view the Exodus as historical. Among the few that even think it's historical, we can't agree on a date. And there are problems with the reliability of biblical genealogies for dating because there are provable gaps. So it's unknown how many other generational gaps may exist that we can't prove. We can prove some. That doesn't mean there are not others, right? So one clear example of genealogical gaps is seen by comparing the genealogies of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew with the list of David's descendants, and you compare it with First Chronicles. In Matthew, the line from Joram to Uzziah is presented as direct, right? Jehoshaphat, the father of Joram, and Joram, the father of Uzziah. Sounds like Uzziah is Joram's kid. That's what Matthew says, right? However, First Chronicle provides a more detailed sequence. Joram, the son, Uzziah, his son, Joaz, his son, Amaziah, his son, Isaiah, his son, in First Chronicles. Okay? Now, these are Isaiah and Uzziah are two different ways to spell the same name. But suddenly we got a bunch of generations in there that aren't even mentioned by Matthew. And the reason is Matthew is making a theological point. He's trying to tie Jesus to David. The name David in Hebrew adds up to the number 14. Matthew puts 3 lists of 14 names. He has to use David twice to get the 3 lists. So David's in 2 of the list of 14. And he puts them together for the purpose of making a theological connection between Jesus and David. So he mentions David twice. He uses 3 groups of 14. He jumps genealogies. He puts women in the genealogies. He's paying fast and loose with Ancestry.com to make a theological point. If we know that's what Matthew did, why would you use him as a source for genealogies? And you can do the same thing in Old Testament genealogies, right? Another gap in the same section, Matthew states Josiah, the father of Jehoiakim, right, and his brothers at the time of the deportation to Babylon. That's in Matthew 1:11. In contrast, 1 Chronicles 3:14 to 16 details Josiah, his son, the sons of Josiah, Johanan, and the firstborn, and the second, Jehoiakim. Descendants of Jehoiakim, Jeconiah, his son, where Jeconiah is another name for without the H is a name for with the H. Here Matthew skips Jehoiakim, presenting Josiah as the direct father of Jeconiah. And it demonstrates these demonstrable omissions appear when comparing the genealogies from Shem to Abraham in Genesis, with a parallel in Luke's genealogy of Jesus, right? Where it says in Genesis 11:12, where Arpachshad lived 35 years and fathered Shelah, right? But Luke says the father of Eber, the son of Shelah, and the son of Canaan, and the son of Arpachshad, and the son of Shem. Okay? So we get a bunch, Arpachshad is spelled Arphaxad in context, but it's the same figure. And this shows that Genesis omits Canaan, the second Canaan. That's not the Canaan from Adam and Eve, it's different Canaan, right? highlighting a gap in the Genesis account. So the gaps are not just in the New Testament, the gaps are in the Old Testament, and they continue. You can do this with almost every genealogy in the Old Testament. So why you would do what Bishop Usher did and try to count up the genealogies and get to the date of creation is beyond me. The genealogy of Ezra in the book of Ezra abbreviates the high priestly line compared to the fuller account in 1 Chronicles. Ezra 7, 1-5 lists his ancestry in descent order. This is Aaron to Eleazar to Phinehas to Abishua to Buki to Uzi to Zerahiah, Meroth, Azariah, Amir, Ahitub, Zadok, Shalom, Hilkiah, Azariah, Seraiah to Ezra. However, 1 Chronicles 6:14, 4-15 provides a more extensive list. Ezra's version omits several names such as Amahiz, Johanan, and an additional Azariah, Amariah, and Ahitub, and a Zadok cycle between the first and Zadok and Shalom. We get a bunch of names omitted from this genealogy. In addition to the gaps in the genealogies, you got a problem between the Masoretic text and the Septuagint on the ages of the patriarchs. In Genesis 5, which gives you a genealogy, remember the one so-and-so begets, lives so many years, and then he begets the next person, right? From Adam to the flood. In the Masoretic text, if you add them up, it comes up to 1,656 years. But if you add up the ages in the Septuagint, it's 2,242 to 2,262 years, resulting in a difference of about 586 to 606 years. In Genesis 11, from the flood to Abraham, the Masoretic text adds 352 years from the flood to Abraham's birth, while the Septuagint extends the period further due to higher begetting ages and an extra Canaan. Remember that guy Canaan that's in there? And so it gets you an extra 700 to 80 to 800 years. You add up all these differences, just in those two genealogies, there's 1,386 years of history that is missing from the genealogies in the Bible, if the Septuagint is correct. Well, it's at least, it's either missing or in question. So to me, genealogies is not the way I want to start dating things, right? But when you look at, you go, okay, well, I'll go to Egyptian sources. They must be reliable, correct? Wrong. They're equally difficult problems with, they do seriation or sequence dating. They also do stratigraphy, and this is the different layers of rock, right? Topology. They use King's List and regnal years. And these systems produce wildly different dates. They claim to use them all, but when they're dating something, they use the one that lines up with the date they want to reach. Even dating systems labeled absolute dating systems by Egyptologists, right? Depend on assumptions like carbon-14 testing. Assumes that carbon-14 breaks down at the same rate under every environmental condition. They dated the rocks that came out of Mount St. Helens. Many of us were alive and watched Mount St. Helens blow. They dated those rocks. They sent them off to labs to have them dated with radiocarbon dating and carbon-14 dating and different things. And they were all dated thousands of years ago. We saw the rocks form. We saw them come out of the volcano. They said that happened thousands of years ago, because it's not taking into consideration what was going on in the heat of the volcano, right? Another supposedly absolute dating system, right? Known as the Sothic sighting, cycle, contains assumptions in Egyptology about calendar stability and observation accuracy, which have been increasingly being questioned, not by Christians, by Egyptologies. And they are saying we can't use the Sothic cycle. It's not a reliable system of dating. So they in their own writings among themselves say their systems for dating things that happen in Egypt are not reliable. We know the chronologies in the Bible are not reliable systems for dating. And so this lack of absolute anchors for early periods leads to this what is called floating chronologies, right? Regional variations, incomplete archaeological evidence, and debate over evidence or interpretation. Like what's a pre-dynastic dating? It creates uncertainty. Some argue the methods are paradigm driven, what you want to assume, right? And the assumptions you make will alter the results. And so this is going on. So I was really disappointed in this book because none of that was brought up. Nobody absolutely defended the Bible. Now, when I did my 5 series on Exodus, making fun of all those people that make up the videos and claim that the Mount Sinai is in Saudi Arabia and all this other stuff, the videos are all over the internet. I made fun of them for being hucksters and that. I introduced you to this book, this Israel's Exodus and Transdisciplinary Perspective, right? There are 44 contributors to this book that are actively working in the field research in Egyptology or Exodus-related subjects. These are not some theologian. They're not somebody on the internet with a microphone like me. These are guys that I actually study in, right? It's 544 pages long. It is not an easy read. And the vast majority of these contributors reject the Bible as a reliable source for historical information. And they reject the idea of a historical Exodus altogether. Vast majority is the key word here. Many do acknowledge the existence of evidence which does seem to match the biblical account, but they dismiss the idea that those pieces of evidence actually corroborate the Bible. Yeah, we have Egyptian evidence that says exactly what the Bible says, but that's not corroboration for the Bible. That's just coincidence, right? Now, if I was only aware of the 5 views presented in this book, I'd need to accept Scott's scripting, that the Bible's kind of true, but not 100%, right? He argues for a historical Exodus around 1446. But lucky for me, I read books like the other book. Lucky for me, I have been given access to other data. I'm aware of academic material, like that book I just shown you, where the Exodus is discussed by academics involved in the research. It's clearly the minority view among those researchers that the Bible's true, right? But I'm more interested in their evidence than their spin and interpretation evidence. Tell me what the evidence is. I'll see if it matches the Bible, right? If someone told you that there was a year without a summer and it happened in 1530, but when you went and tried to research AD 1530, there was no evidence of a year without a summer. Would you dismiss the year without a summer as a myth? But what if during your research you did find evidence of a year without a summer in AD 1816? Right? Would you say it's still a myth? Or would you think maybe somebody, maybe both somebody's got their dates wrong? Because if I'm being told there's a year without a summer, and then I find evidence for a year without a summer, but it doesn't fit in the date I was told, the evidence supports the fact there was a year without a summer. The dates are wrong. And this is what's going on in Egyptology, right? Because if the evidence doesn't fit their date, whether they're Egyptologists or a biblical scholar, the date they think the Exodus happens, if there's evidence and it doesn't fit in their date time frame, they dismiss it. Some of the biggest critics of the evidence supporting the Exodus are Christians. because the evidence is not in a time frame, in a century they think the Exodus happened. Problem. So I've shown I don't need any other resource but the Bible to show you the genealogies are bad. Egyptologists openly admit that their kings list aren't strictly chronological. That's because sometimes it was a kingdom called Northern Egypt and a kingdom called Southern Egypt, and sometimes Egypt was one kingdom. When there was Northern Egypt and Southern Egypt, there were two pharaohs. And you have a king's list that presents them like Egypt was one singular nation through its entire history. You have to overlap that king's list. And when you do, the history of Egypt gets way shorter. The way it is, the history of Egypt goes right through the flood. Okay, you adjust it for the pharaohs in northern Egypt and southern Egypt, and suddenly it starts aligning with biblical chronology. In one of the videos that I made fun of on Exodus, that's the one thing they pointed out that was actually true. So if I started looking at the Egyptian record, and I found records of events that seemed to match biblical accounts, I would use those as corroborating events to try to align history, right? But because according to the King's List that they admit are wrong, those events happened centuries earlier than some theologians' interpretation of the genealogies, and the Bible would allow the Exodus to have occurred. They're dismissing it, both the Egyptologists and the biblical scholars. And just like my example from A Year Without a Summer, I would assume that somebody, maybe both somebody's got their dates wrong. Not that the data is wrong. Data doesn't lie. It's the interpretation of data that gets to be a problem. The data corroborates the Bible. And just because events are similar doesn't mean that they're the same event. If you looked and studied the evidence for World War I and World War II, many centuries from now, you're going to find many similarities. A lot of the belligerents involved in the war are the same countries, but they're two different wars, correct? So if you see several contributors in this book try to tie the Exodus to the Hyksos expulsion, well, let me show you why that doesn't work. The Hyksos were foreign invaders of Egypt. They conquered and ruled northern Egypt as kings in the 15th dynasty, according to the King's List, 15th dynasty, only to be militarily defeated and expelled by native Egyptian forces. In contrast, the biblical Exodus portrays Israelites as oppressed slaves who were liberated from Egyptian rule, reversing the power dynamics completely. The Hyksos expulsion involved a prolonged military conflict, including sieges in places like Everest. Remember when they tried to move it to Everest? There's a reason. And forced removal after defeat. The Exodus narrative describes a voluntarily escape facilitated by divine miracles and the parting of the sea. No direct military conquest, ever. These don't line up with the Hyksos, but they're trying to force it in there, right? The Hyksos were an elite ruling class who dominated Egypt, building on their own capital and imposing their own authority. The Israelites are depicted as subjugated labor force, building store cities for Pharaoh, not as rulers or invaders. The Hyksos were led by kings like Ophis, emphasizing a dynastic rule. Exodus features Moses, a prophetic leader in Pharaoh's court, who negotiates with Pharaoh and leads through religious authority and miracles. There's no parallel in the Hyksos accounts. Egyptian records of the Hyksos expulsion focus on heroic military victories with no mention of plagues, supernatural intervention, or divine judgment matching the 10 plagues in the Exodus story. The Hyksos expulsion primarily involved a ruling elite, their army, and associated Canaanite groups, not a massive civilian population. The Exodus describes over 600,000 men plus women and children. That's a vast multitude of families fleeing in a unified group. The Hyksos represented a diverse mix of Canaanites and Semitic peoples from various origins, not a genetically or culturally cohesive group like Israel, descended from a single patriarch like Jacob. The biblical Israelites are portrayed as distinct, unified ethnic group with a shared ancestry and religious identity. None of this applies to the Hyksos. So trying to make the Exodus be part of the Hyksos is playing fast and loose with the truth, right? They're playing with the data. After the expulsion, the Hyksos retreated directly to fortified cities in southern Canaan, like Sharuhan. The Exodus involves 40 years in the wilderness wandering in Sinai, receiving laws on Mount Sinai, and delayed conquest of Canaan. With no such prolonged detour in the Hyksos history. The Egyptian sources celebrate the Hyksos expulsion as a triumphant reclamation of sovereignty of hated foreigners, often erasing and vilifying their rule. Egyptologists claim there are no Egyptian records of a humiliating loss by slaves in the pursuit of ending disaster, which would contradict the prideful tone of the victory over the Hyksos. I'm going to address this claim later, because there is one it's called the destruction of mankind. It's the Egyptian record that sees their defeat so complete that instead of Egypt being destroyed, they present it like the whole world is destroyed from this. And despite the overwhelming evidence that these are not the same events or even the same people, two of the contributors of this book, who claim to be Christian and claim to believe the Bible, contributed stuff that's aimed at the lay public. And they worked from this demonstrably false position that the Hyksos expulsion might be the biblical Exodus story. That's problematic for me. When the book's being produced by Christians, for Christians and the laity that do not study Egyptology, have not spent time looking into the Exodus, and they're starting from demonstrably false premises. And one reason given for the later dates, or reducing the size of the Israelite population, right, in this book, was supported by the lack of evidence of Semitic population groups. So now I'm going to take you back to the book that I showed you a little bit earlier. In chapter 4, Manfred Beitek, he's an Egyptologist and an excavator of Tel El Dab near ancient Avaris, one of these cities that keeps coming up, right? He argues that archaeological evidence from the eastern Nile Delta reveals a significant Semitic population during the late Second Intermediate Period, early New Kingdom. So this is 1750 to 1500 BC, with continued presence into the 12th century BC. Bible believing guys said there's no evidence. The Egyptology says there's a ton of evidence. Beitek, he's not a Christian. He doesn't even believe in the historicity of the Bible. He's definitely not developing it. He thinks this is a myth. But he is showing you the evidence. The actual data says there was a significant Semitic population there during that period. Now, I may question his dates, but if you're telling me there's no evidence, and then I go to the Egyptologists and they go, yeah, there's plenty of evidence, right? In chapter 18 of that book, Susan Tower Hollis, another Egyptologist, and she's specializing in Egyptian literature. Okay, she's not out digging up stuff. She's looking at Egypt. The texts talk about a going forth or a mass departure from northeastern Africa, Egypt. She discusses sources like the Tale of Sinu, which is from 1875 BC. Like I said, take all these dates with a grain of salt. But if you have a mass exodus being recorded in 1875 BC, is it possible that Exodus is describing a Egyptian or Israelite exodus which happened before that book was written? Other narratives of refugees and groups leaving Egypt. She's found multiple sources. That's the one source she lists in the thing. Wait, I thought there was no evidence of any mass migration. Didn't that what those Bible guys just told me? There's no evidence? How come the Egyptologists keep finding evidence? Right? And they claim they had to change the text of the Bible because there's no evidence of this major group. The problem is that according to the admitted flaws in the dating system used by Egyptologists and by these biblical scholars, these Exodus-like events, or these events that seem to match the Exodus account, may have happened as early as the 19th century BC. Well, if you think the Exodus happened in the 13th or 15th century, then you just toss out the evidence of them in the 19th century, right? Unless maybe your dates are wrong. Is that possible? Is it possible, since you're both using flawed dating systems, that your dates are wrong? But so far, we're only talking about similarities. Just like I said, there's similarities between World War I and World War II. It doesn't mean they're the same. But when you get to chapter 19, Brad Sparks, who's a researcher in ancient Near Eastern texts, and in full disclosure, Brad Sparks is a friend of mine. We're not that close. I haven't talked to him in years. I used to be a researcher at the Christian Research Institute. If you're not familiar with that, it was started by Walter Martin. He was there with Hank Hanegraaff. Brad was there. He's a researcher extraordinaire. He has spent the last, 40 years focused on the Exodus, right? And he discusses Egyptian inscriptions and papyri for parallels, right? And they exist Exodus elements like plagues and darkness and divine and thing. He mentions the admonition of Ippur and the papyrus laden and the tempest-steeled Atmos and the Seti I Karnak relief descriptions, right? Most of these are dated in like 1550 BC or earlier, right? And he argues that they echo historical events that inspired biblical plagues, like in Exodus chapters 7 to 12. The Red Sea crossing suggested a Exodus narrative reevaluated in light of these parallels, potentially indicating a historical core around the Hyksos period or later. And Sparks' emphasis on iconographic elements like storm motifs as supporting evidence. Okay, Brad went through their stuff, and he's looking at their text and how the Egyptians would have described the Exodus, not how the Jews would have described it, right? And to do it, like I said, I've actually seen more of Brad's stuff. I've read 2 of his draft books, okay? Still to be published because he's getting a lot of pushback from Christians against it, okay? But so I have it. So I have a unique advantage that none of these 5 authors have. But even the book that I referenced is available at you can order it at any bookstore. But like I said, 3 years ago, last time I talked to Brad, he had already documented 700 corroborations from Egyptian records, not biblical records, Egyptian records of events described in the biblical Exodus. 700. I thought there was none. Okay? Now, in his contribution to this book, he only has, he had 1 chapter. You can't go through all that, right? But he's corroborated the plagues, including the death of the firstborn in the Egyptian records. The Egyptian story known as the destruction of mankind, or sometimes called the Book of the Heavenly Cow. It's inscribed on tombs during the New Kingdom from 1550 to 1070 BC, assuming those dates are correct. The earliest known copies in the burial shrines of Tutankhamun and Seti I. While recorded in the New Kingdom, the text is written in Middle Egyptian, suggesting its original composition likely dates to earlier Middle Kingdom period. That it's being recorded here, but it happened before, right? It describes events that are so devastating to Egypt that they're presented as the end of the world as they knew it. There should be an E in they. I'm talking biblical here. Thy knew it, right? And so suddenly I went from there's no evidence to there's a lot of evidence, right? Now, one of the things Brad found is an Egyptian source where they named the god they blamed for the destruction. And the name they use is the Israelites' God's name, Yahweh. That's who they blame for the destruction of mankind. Well, that's pretty interesting, isn't it? On the wall of the tomb of Amenhotep II, typically dated 427 to 401 or 427 to 397 BC, according to Egyptologists, there are reliefs showing waters parted, the waters coming together again, dead soldiers floating in the waters. There's a map with the route of the Exodus. There's a pharaoh entombed under the water. There's also shows the queen searching for the pharaoh. But the critics of Brad say his interpretation of those images is anachronistic, that he has a unique interpretation. They think all those imageries talk about the path into the afterlife. Brad's going, I'm looking at something that looks like waters parted, waters coming back together, and drowned soldiers, right? And the interpretation. The real problem is that the evidence doesn't match the dates Egyptologists or the biblical scholars as the likely dates for the evidence. Because if their dating of those tombs is correct, then this evidence is too early, right? But I'm telling you, it's more likely the dates are wrong, right? Now, in Amenhotep's tomb, there's a room off to the side. It's not hidden. I don't know why they call it the secret or hidden chamber, because it's just an open room off to the side. Okay? And I'm not saying that what is in there is being suppressed. But you can go on Getty Images and look at pictures of that room, and a lot of these images that I'm telling you are there don't show up in the Getty Images. They show up in hand-painted recreations that scholars use. But I did find in one of their photos, at the bottom of the photo, you can actually see the drowned soldiers in the picture. So even Getty didn't get it totally out of there. But if you scroll through them, you can find the drowned soldiers floating in the bottom of the water. It's at the very bottom of one of their photos. But I haven't seen in their photos Pharaoh in the tomb. I haven't seen the water parted, all that stuff. But I have seen it on academic sites, right? I've seen it discussed by academics. And so I'm asking, is this information being hidden from you? And I'm not a big conspiracy theorist, but I'm just saying it undermines the standard narrative that this Amduat book in the hidden chamber of Amenhotep the tomb is the primary journey into the afterlife. Because you could take school children in there and look at these images, and they're going to not look like Journey into the Afterlife. Now, I copied this from the book, okay? But these images come from a academic site looking at this wall. Now, you see the top image? Top two images, right? One's a enlargement of the very top image, okay? There's a bunch of hieroglyphics between two blue sections, right? Is that those blue sections water? Because what it says in the hieroglyphics between the water is the water had once been present and will return in deadly fashion. That sure looks like the parted Red Sea to me, right? What are they talking about on this journey to the afterlife? That the waters were parted and now they return in deadly fashion. And then you have this image. That look like dead soldiers to you floating in the water? Bunch of Egyptians floating sideways underneath the water when the water returns in deadly fashion? And this is somebody working on the artistic recreations, because they don't allow photography anymore in Amenhotep's tomb. So they're basically going in there and making drawings and repainting them out for scholars to study. You know, now I'm not at liberty to share with you non-published photos from this tomb, but I'm telling you, I've seen them. And they show Pharaoh they show the route of the Exodus. right? I consider that evidence. I'm just curious as to why that evidence isn't being available to all of us or to, people at large. Is it because it tells a story that there's really a God, and the God that caused the Exodus and brought Israelites out of Egypt? Now, I don't think Amenhotep II is the Pharaoh of the Exodus. And the reason I don't is I don't think they would build a massive, beautiful tomb for a Pharaoh responsible for the destruction of mankind. For such a massive loss, I don't think that's what would have happened. And we will see this in Egyptian history when an embarrassing event happens to a pharaoh's. They go back and they destroy his statues, they tear down his tomb, they do stuff, they repurpose his tomb for a different pharaoh. And they try to wipe him out of Egyptian history. Pharaohs like Horemheb and Seti I, they destroyed monuments to earlier pharaohs, Akhenaten and Tutankhamun, to erase them from history. Statues of Queen Hatshepsut, oh God, I hate these names, were intentionally broken and buried, believed to be ordered by Thutmose III as retribution or to remove her from the line of legitimate rulers. So we have plenty of evidence of this happening. So if I were looking for a pharaoh as the Pharaoh of the Exodus, and I know the Exodus is recorded in Amenhotep's tomb, I would look for a pharaoh that doesn't have a tomb. Maybe in the let's go 500 years back from the time of him. And if I do that, and I look for pharaohs that are missing from history, who either don't have a tomb or whose tomb is a disputed tomb, right? I got Thutmose II in 1492 to 1479. I told you all these dates are just Egyptologist dates. Amos I, 1550 to 1525. Amenhotep I, 1525 to 1504. Did it happen during his dad's, in Amenhotep the first reign? Is that why Amenhotep II has it on his thing? Kamuz, 1555 to 1550. He didn't reign long. Apepe or Apophis, 1580 to it should be not 154, but probably 1540 BC. Missed a zero there, right? No, it can't be 1540. It's got to be 1550. All right. And I'm not claiming that the dates used by Egyptologists are correct, because I know that they admit in their own writing they're unreliable. But if I use these as baseline dates just to start with, and I assume that these dates go back to the Hyksos, I'd start with these guys. But then there's one theory, like I said, is that the reason the Hyksos were able to conquer Egypt is because Egypt was weakened by the Exodus. So I might even go back further than the Hyksos, looking for a pharaoh of the Exodus. But I just want you to see, when people tell you there's no evidence for the Bible, and there's no evidence for the Exodus, and the Bible's a myth, right? They're making assumptions. And if they don't like the data, what the data actually says, they just ignore the data. They go, oh yeah, it's too early. We can't use that one. That data doesn't count. I said, show me the data without the assumptions and let me decide for myself what's true. So if you're new here, it is my practice that when I get through my study, I put on a song. I need a minute to go through all the different chats. So I'm going to put on Psalm 51, which is a little longer for me. It's kind of a rock and roll version of that psalm. I'm going to go try to read the various chats and the comments, and then I'll be back and talk to you. Okay? Okay, I'm back. So yeah, Beach Bum and Mermaid, even though the word rabbi means teacher, that name's really associated with Jewish teachers. I don't like any labels. I especially don't like, um, you know, uh, labels like Reverend. I mean, that's just, my God, I hate that. Um, I'm just somebody that loves God's word. I love God. I love to study His word, and I read a lot of academic stuff. And I think if that academic stuff can be brought down into language that the average person that doesn't want to spend their life in a research library and just is kind of interested in it, if you break it down, your average person is going to understand that, hey, if there's problems with the dating system, maybe you shouldn't be so solid on your dates. If you admit that your dating system has a problem, why would you stick to these dates and put them out there? And I hammer on that a lot, from biblical side and for other. There's a lot of history not in the Bible. The Bible's the history of the Jewish people generally, right? Yeah, it gives you from Genesis to Abraham, and then the rest of the Bible is kind of the history of Jewish people and redemption. It's a theologically based story. It includes history. It includes history, but it's not meant as a chronology of all of human history. So I don't expect the Bible to be something it doesn't even claim to be. But I also don't buy into these ideas that just because somebody comes up with a date based on King's List that I can show are not chronological, that I should just accept their date either. I believe in questioning everything, everyone and everything. Where's the beef? Where's the substance? Right? And when I look at this stuff, I see a lot of evidence for the Exodus. Yeah, it doesn't neatly fit into dates I would like it to fit into. But I'm not certain of my dates either, because I'm using the same kind of assumptions they are. So yeah. So I do want to get out there and, what do you call it? Not flip over in a canoe for a time. So I just want to get through that. I'm going to do my exit here. And then hopefully, so if you're new here, oh, what did I do? Sorry. If you're new here and to my stream, I'm on Pilled a lot, on Pilled as Bill Donahue, on Discerning Truth, on Discerning Truth 534 YouTube. I had Miss Olson's over there on Beach Bum and Mermaids over there today because of battery issues, right? But then you have, I put up both. How come I don't have this one? I'm also on Rumble and X and stuff as Donnie Papa. For whatever reason, I didn't load that slide. And then noon Pacific time, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Like I said, I normally am in the book of the Bible. I'm in Daniel until I finish it, and then I'm going to go to Colossians when I'm done. And then I've been joining Neo on Tuesday but when I change my paddling thing, it'll probably be Wednesday or Friday, and I just blanked out Tuesday on the card. And every Monday I'm going to type in, is it Wednesday or is it Friday? And I'll announce it on Monday what day I'm going to join Neo. But you should be watching Neo 5 days a week. She's lovely. Really has a gift of exhortation, and she just gets together and reads God's word and lets us try to talk to her in the chat with her Bible buddies. I love that. All my notes that I had up here, I'm going to create a PDF after I go off the air. I will upload it on Discerning True Scoops on Telegram. You download it for free. Use it. Go look at your stuff. Right? And if you want to watch it again, replays are easy to find. On Rumble, I have channels. What channel did I put this under? Probably Bible and Interpretation. I would think it is. But that'd be interesting. I don't remember what channel I put it in. And on playlist, I'll put it in a similarly named stuff. But if you're new here, there's a Start Here channel. There's a Start Here playlist. You want to go there first. And then with that, I think I'm going to get out of here for today and go have some fun. And so God bless you all for coming, for listening. Thank you for listening. And hopefully I'll be back here, God willing, on Monday. And we're going to continue through Daniel and Daniel chapter 10 on Monday. I'll do 10 on Monday, 11 on Wednesday, and then next Friday we'll hit another book, right? God bless you. I'm out of here. Walk